All right, we're back online, and thank you, Kelley. We're very honored to have you here and join us today. Thank you for supporting the community and the Red Team Village, as well as the Texas Cyber Summit. The floor is yours, so please take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you. Hello, everyone. It's morning for me here in New York, but thank you for joining us today, wherever you may be. I'm going to be talking a lot about two-factor authentication today. That's a lot of the stuff that I focus my time and research on, both at my job and kind of in the communities that I support. And one of the things that kind of inspired this talk was tweets like this, where Troy Hunt, if you're familiar with him, runs a pretty well-known password breach database and site called haveibeenowned.com. And he says, I had a fascinating chat about how the absence of an email address in the system is an indicator that it may not be a legit one. And services that compile data breaches like this are so common now, and we have so many data breaches that the reality in 2020 is that we basically expect a legitimate email address to be seen in a data breach. And Troy's project proves that simple passwords like 1234556 are still incredibly common, and even complex passwords aren't secure if they're being reused across sites. And his site is, evidence of that even if you have a password that you might have, made really long, if you're using it across multiple sites and then it gets compromised in a data breach, you're kind of SOL. And so the whole idea here, and the reason I bring this up, is that, passwords are no longer enough. I think that's something that most people in this community are more than, familiar with at this point. But the reality is that, we're so owned now that passwords aren't going to be the answer going forward. And so we have to think at other solutions like two-factor authentication to help our customers stay more secure. And I want to focus on framing this in terms of what we can do to protect the customers of the businesses that we support, because as security professionals, we're the paranoid ones that probably have good enough OPSEC for our own accounts, but it's also our job to protect other people that are using these sites and services that we build. So my name is Kelley Robinson. I have been working at Twilio for about 3 years now. At Twilio, I specifically support our account security products. And so we do have products for things like phone verification, phone intelligence, and two-factor authentication. So Twilio acquired Authy about 5 years ago. So Authy is our free consumer application for two-factor authentication that you might be familiar with. And then we also have APIs that we do sell to customers. But one of the things that I spend a good chunk of my time on is educating developers about security and figuring out how we can make our APIs more usable for developers and people that are implementing these systems at their own companies. And so this is going to incorporate a lot of the things that I've learned in the last few years working with developers and our customers on their authentication challenges. It's not a talk about Twilio at all, just some of the underlying things that I have learned doing a lot of research on two-factor authentication. And so in order to kind of frame this discussion, I wanted to talk quickly about some of the commonalities of what we're building and walk through a few assumptions. So for our authenticated system, we assume that the user has something of value tied to their account. And this is very baseline, because I know that a lot of the systems that you're building have different threat models and have different types of customers that might be accessing different amounts of value. But we can assume that all those customers have value. And we can also assume that that user can only access that value once they've been authenticated, and that is proven by some measure that they are the owner of that account. And finally, there's this assumption that an impersonator could also access that value if they can also prove that they're the owner of that account. And so this is known as ATO, or account takeover. And a lot of what we're going to be thinking about is how not to make this step worth it for the attacker. And so for the red team people out there, how to make this not worth your time, or make it hard enough that it's not financially viable for you to or for attacker to breach a system like this. Because the failure of good authentication often results in this ATO, and this is a $4 billion problem. And so the industry is incentivized to find a solution here. They don't want their customers to lose money. They don't want themselves to lose money. And so they want to make sure that the authentication, the balance there of adding that additional friction, is good enough that it makes it not worth the attacker's time. And so to protect our accounts, we need to use a factor for authentication. Using any two of these means that you're using two-factor authentication. So the three types of factors, just a quick refresh: something that you know, like a password, something that you have, like a phone or a key, and something that you are, like fingerprint or biometrics. And the second factors that we're going to be talking about today all fall into this possession category. These are all kind of on top of something like a knowledge password, like a password, or knowledge factor like a password. And we're not going to be really diving into biometrics today. But I would just kind of wanted to go over a few of the different factors that we have available in that 2FA category and kind of talk about some of the pros and cons for each one of them, starting with SMS-based 2FA. And so one of the big reasons that this is still so popular is that onboarding is really, really easy. And that's because in America, at least 99% of people have a phone capable of receiving text messages already. And that means that they don't have to install an additional application. They don't have to go through any kind of additional setup to get this installed. And this is really important because, as we'll talk about later, like, it doesn't matter if you offer 2FA if none of your customers actually use it. And there's a couple of ways that you can get around that. You could enforce 2FA, but a lot of companies aren't at the point where they can do that, especially for consumer-facing applications. If you're an enterprise and you want your employees to use 2FA, it's a lot easier to enforce that and enforce stronger methods for and stronger factors and channels for 2FA. But especially for the consumer application space, we see that SMS-based 2FA is still really effective. Because the onboarding means that people are actually going to use it. But that being said, like, SMS is not a secure channel for two-factor authentication. And that's because SS7 vulnerabilities, the signaling system 7, there's a vulnerability in inter-carrier telecom switching that basically allows you to impersonate a carrier and route messages that are meant for someone else to yourself. And then there's also the arguably more common method here is SIM swapping. And so when you use social engineering or bribery to get my SIM card sent to you, we've seen a lot of this happen in the course of the last few years for high profile targets or people that are tweeting about how many Bitcoin they have. So, don't tweet about how many Bitcoin you have might be one of the takeaways there. But also the SMS is just not a secure channel. It's not encrypted. It's subject to man-in-the-middle attacks. And so it's not going to be the most secure channel for delivering one-time passcodes. Super convenient, but it's not really that secure is kind of the takeaway here. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was TOTP, or time-based one-time passwords. We sometimes call these soft tokens. And so this is a way to generate tokens based on an algorithm. You would use an application like Google Authenticator or Authy for this. And so inputs to this algorithm are a secret key that's usually shared when you scan that QR code when you're enabling this type of 2FA. And then the second input is your system time, and those get put through a one-way function that then will pop out this truncated token. And because this is symmetric key cryptography, that offers increased security compared to SMS, but there's still the potential for somebody to get access to that shared secret. And if they do, then the method is compromised because system time is pretty easy to glean as well. But this does offer some distinct advantages because both of those inputs are available offline. The whole method for 2FA here is offline, and it's also an open standard. This is based on RFC, and so this can be used across multiple applications. It doesn't require any proprietary technology, but unfortunately, it does require an app download. And in a study on the usability of different factors, researchers found that 2/3 of participants found that using Google Authenticator for TOTP, they had problems entering the 6-digit code before it timed out. And so for people that aren't used to this as a authentication method, this might be a little bit challenging for them with the timeout. So overall, this is a pretty good option, and we see a lot of security-conscious companies adding TOTP as the 2FA option. This is definitely something that I encourage people to do if they are concerned about the SMS security, especially because it doesn't. There's like open source code libraries for this. You can implement this yourself as long as you're a little bit careful about how you do that. But this is going to be a pretty good option, but it's not perfect. Another thing that we see a lot of is push authentication. And so this can either be done in a third-party application, like Dual Authenticator is really popular for this, or you can build this into your own application. And so Google Prompt is being used for this a lot. And so Google is has recognized that, hey, like a lot of our users have at least one Google application on their phone. And so when they're trying to log into their desktop application, they're trying to log into their Gmail account, what if we sent a prompt to their phone that has asymmetric key cryptography? So every device is registered with its own private key. And then that can verify the user by saying, hey, I have access to this device. I must be who I say I am because I can authenticate from another live session on a different device. And users love this because it's so low friction. You can approve or deny a login request right from your Apple Watch sometimes. And because, it uses the asymmetric key cryptography, the private key is only ever going to be stored on the device. So you don't have to worry about leaking a shared secret like you would with TOTP. And this is the only form of 2FA that really adds the option to explicitly deny a login. You think about TOTP or SMS-based 2FA. Like if you get an SMS message that's like, hey, here's your 2FA code. Like, what do you do with that if you're not trying to log in right then? Maybe go change your password, but otherwise you don't really have any way to give feedback that that wasn't you. Unfortunately, this is so low friction that you could easily approve an authentication request just to get rid of it. So if somebody's attempting to attack your accounts or do some kind of credential stuffing attack in the middle of the night, you might unintentionally approve a request. I don't have any data about how common this is, but this is something that people talk about pretty often when it comes to push authentication as a method. And so just kind of wanted to mention that as a potential downside. And then in terms of onboarding, it does require a special app. And so like with TOTP, getting users to download another app is always going to be a challenge. But like with the Google example, if your users or a good portion of your users already have an app installed on their phone, you can build this directly into your application. And that's a good option for adding some more secure authentication that might be just as easy to use as something like SMS-based 2FA, but a lot more secure. So this seems great. It's cryptographically secure. Might be too convenient. I think there's a lot of potentials here that we'll see people using this more and more going forward because of the cryptographic security. And the next thing that I wanted to think of, or to talk about that I also think is kind of where we're headed in terms of authentication is WebAuthn. And this is like the new hotness, and for good reason. It offers a high level of security with asymmetric key crypto. So it has that same level of like cryptographic security, if you want to take that as a measure, as push authentication does. But it's also an open standard like TOTP is. So the biggest drawbacks right now is that this is still relatively new technology, and the setup can be a little clunky, especially if you're looking at like consumer-based applications. You have to think about how are people going to get these devices? How are people going to recover these devices? And that's especially if you think about something like a YubiKey or a physical security key that's separate from a device that you might already have. You need an authenticator that's compatible with the standard, and YubiKeys and like Google Titan keys, those aren't exactly cheap or reasonable to expect every user of your application will have one. However, as more devices that we already have, like our phones, start to adopt this standard, so if I can then use my iPhone as a WebAuthn authenticator, then this standard, I think, becomes a lot more reasonable to expect people to use and to onboard with. We'll see an uptake in this as a factor in the next couple of years, I'm sure. Right now, it's still really popular within companies because the IT department can hand or mail you a physical token, and there's a smoother path to account recovery there. And so I did want to back this up with some quantitative data. And to do that, I think we have to think a little bit more granularly about how we're measuring the effectiveness of 2FA. And so I've mentioned some of these things already, but like if you separate this into three categories, there's different experiences that you have to take into account for the different types of usage for 2FA. And so you have to think about how you're onboarding users for these new factors and channels, what the user experience is for ongoing use at every login or every other login, or however often you're enforcing that, and what the experience is for account recovery. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about like how you do setup. And so from a study in 2018 that focused on YubiKeys, I thought this was really interesting because the setup success varied a lot depending on the platform that people were using. And so the idea was like, we're going to use YubiKeys to add 2FA to Google and Facebook and Windows 10. 83% of people had success with Google, while only 32% of people had success with Facebook. And so if you've been following things like this, a lot has changed with WebAuthn since 2018. But I do think this is a really interesting look at how onboarding user experience impacts user success, because it was the same actual key that they were using. It was the same channel that people were setting up, but whatever Google had done here to onboard people and get these factors set up, it was a lot more successful than some of the other platforms that people tried to do this. And, as you might see, there are more people actually locked themselves out of their computer than were able to set this up for one form of Windows authorization tool. And so there's, some learnings to be taken away there, that you definitely want to make sure that people complete one successful authentication before you flip the switch that says, hey, we have 2FA turned on, because in this case, there wasn't enough documentation or a walkthrough on the onboarding setup to make users successful there. But then we start to look at usability and ongoing usability of these factors from a 2019 study of how usable several different types of factors were. They found that U2F, or WebAuthn, and push authentication had the fastest median authentication times. If you're familiar with those factors, that's not really surprising. But if you compare this with SMS, according to some Duo Authenticator research, this can save people a significant amount of time every year, depending on how often they're logging into with their account. But if you don't have to go find your device and enter that code, this can save people a lot of time. So time is one measure of usability. But another measure of usability is this SUS score, or the System Usability Scale. And this is a standard measurement used by researchers for trying to gain how usable some kind of system is. And all of the methods actually had a pretty good usability score, but TOTP actually came out on top there. And so this is good news for people that might want to be adding an additional form of more secure 2FA to their systems. But this actually surprised me, because this was the same study that said that 2/3 of people had issues with the TOTP timeout. And so I guess the fact that they might have gotten timed out of that system didn't really affect how much they self-reported that they actually liked it as a factor. And maybe that's because they felt like it was more secure. There's a lot of things that could go into the user psychology here, but this one did come out on top. And of course, if you're looking at the chart there, you might also notice that actually just passwords was winning, but we want to look at the actual so users actually like not having 2FA more than they liked any of the other forms, of course, but when it comes to actually using 2FA, this was the most popular method. But there is also somewhat of an inverse relationship here when it comes to time it takes to authenticate and how much people actually like the factor. And so the researchers actually observed that faster authentication does not necessarily mean higher usability, because push and U2F, while they had the fastest median times for authentication, were also some of the lower scores. So, just something to take into account there, that maybe time to authenticate isn't the overall gold standard for some of these things. And so I do want to make sure to mention this, because I know there's a lot of trade-offs and levels of security in these options, but I do really think it's important to note that SMS-based 2FA is still better than no 2FA at all in a lot of circumstances. Maybe not every circumstance, and we can debate that later. And I constantly think about this, because it's easy for me to say this is obviously a product my company offers, but there's actually research for me to back this up. And in a Google study from May of last year, said that they found that an SMS code sent to a recovery phone number helped block 100% of automated bots, 96% of bulk phishing attacks, and 76% of targeted attacks. And so this is really great, because if people actually have this form enabled and are more likely to enable this form, that's still going to prevent them from credential stuffing attacks. It's still going to protect people that might have weak passwords. There's still going to be some benefits for enabling any kind of 2FA, even if it's not the most secure form of 2FA. But also, none of this matters if people don't actually turn on the factor, right? So I already kind of introduced this a little bit earlier, but overall adoption of optional 2FA or opt-in 2FA is pretty abysmal. I haven't found industry-wide citations for this, or statistics for this rather, but it's somewhere less than 2% for consumer-facing applications that have 2FA. And there are a few reasons for that. So the BYU study from 2019 found that people were willing to add 2FA if they saw value in the account, but 13% of participants just thought the inconvenience was always going to be too high. And, you know, a lot of people just believe that they're not a target. One participant noted, like, I don't think that I have anything that people would want to take from me. And so that's why I haven't been very worried about this. And like, we can all kind of picture this person in our lives. And maybe that's even us, that like there's certain accounts that we're just like, I don't care if this account gets taken over, because either I don't understand the value of it, or like I don't think there's any value of it. And we always have to take into consideration how much the user values what's in the account, because that's going to affect how much time they're willing to spend on the account security for that. But you know, hope isn't lost. Awareness and adoption have almost doubled in the last couple of years. So this is from a Duo study from last year. So people that have heard of 2FA jumped from 44% to 77%. People that have used 2FA is up to 53% in that time period. You know, some things that have happened in that time period is includes the fact that like the price of Bitcoin spiked, and so that might have like increased people's awareness of 2FA during, you know, in late 2017 there. But some of this is also like how we're driving adoption of multi-factor authentication. Websites are getting more savvy about how they're getting people to turn on 2FA. Unless you're somebody like, you know, a Coinbase or a Bitcoin exchange of some kind, you're probably not going to make 2FA mandatory. There's certain websites that are thinking about doing this for like email servers, but you have other options for getting users to enable two-factor authentication than just hiding it in profile settings. And we know that product strategies like product incentives work, and we can look at Google Trends for 2FA searches. And so if anybody can guess what that spike was in August of 2018, I'm not totally sure if anybody's going to guess this, but this was actually when Fortnite decided to offer in-game incentives for its users to turn on 2FA. And so that was a really, really big moment, because it made a lot of people that weren't previously aware of 2FA all of a sudden think about this as a way that they could get an in-game perk. And now, even like 2 years after this, 3 of the top 5 related search queries to 2FA have to do with Fortnite. And, you know, these are like Epic Games is the company that owns Fortnite here. And so like, you know, these aren't the only companies that are offering incentives. And so like gaming companies are actually really good at this. And it's easy because like in-game incentives and in-game perks and that kind of thing like don't actually cost them any money to offer. And so it's a really good way to get people to opt into more security by offering them something in the game that's valuable to them, but like really doesn't cost the company any money. But they're not the only ones offering incentives. Like gaming companies aren't. Companies like MailChimp offer a 10% discount for accounts that turn on 2FA. And you can think about the math for your own company there. Like, how would that work out? And what is the value there that you could offer to consumers that might save you from potential account takeover and that kind of thing? And so, you know, I do want to kind of wrap this up by thinking about how you can measure success and how you can think about the effectiveness of the different strategies that you employ here. So, like everything, this is going to depend on your business, but here are some of the things that you might want to measure. So, overall losses due to account takeover, you probably want to make sure that those are going down. You probably want the number of compromised accounts to be going down as well. I think this is the really important one that you want to be thinking about. You definitely want to be really good friends with your support team here as you're thinking about how to add or revamp or add additional channels or factors to your two-factor authentication like workflow. So you definitely want to befriend the support team and look at how support costs are changing relative to losses. And so adding additional security to every user's account might actually increase the number of support tickets that you're getting. But if it's actually then decreasing the amount of account takeover that's occurring, that's still a good thing. And so just be aware and be mindful of the fact that like support tickets probably will go up. You can look at different time. You can be kind of intentional about this and do some preparation for some of the times that this might affect you. I can tell from experience, like on the Aupie team, we definitely see support tickets go up every time that there's a new iPhone released and during the holidays when people tend to get new phones. And so those are things that you can kind of prepare for. There's definitely strategies for mitigating that, like sending out emails to people around those times being like, hey, do you have recovery tokens stored? Hey, like make sure that you like save your account credentials in a way, or like set up recovery tokens if you're going to get a new phone and that kind of stuff. But then you also want to be looking at user satisfaction and making sure that that's also at least staying the same or if not going up. So like everything with security, there's not going to be a one size fits all solution here. We think about this across like the enterprise. If you're doing like IT and account security for your employees versus a consumer facing application, there's a huge difference there. And then if you're in the consumer facing application side of things, like there's a huge difference depending on what type of business you have and the types of customers that you have too. Like not every customer needs to be treated the same. If you're in banking, maybe you enforce higher account security for people that have over a certain balance in their accounts. There's different ways that you can segment your users like that, even if it's not going to be based on the type of business that you're in. But you want to be intentional, you want to consider your users, and you want to optimize that friction accordingly. Because like the security researcher Cormac Hurley says, when we exaggerate all dangers, we simply train users to ignore us. So I hope I've given you some information and inspiration for how to think about your authentication systems. I'm around on Twitter. You can find me at Kelley Robinson if you have any questions. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and for supporting the community here, Kelley. And for all the attendees, feel free to join the conversation at our Discord servers. You will find the link at the event website in the bottom of the screen here. We will go in a brief break, and the next presenter will be live in about 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.